Andrew Corbett-Nolan. I'm the Chief Executive of the Good Governance Institute, and I'm a Professor of Governance at the University of Chester. The Good Governance Institute is now entering its 12th year. We work mainly in the public sector right across the United Kingdom. We support boards, use governance as a platform to do wonderful things, improve care, improve services, and improve our opportunities for citizens. So 354 years ago, at the beginning of September, a fire had raged through London for 5 days. It had displaced about 100,000 people, which was a fifth of the city's population. So then, like now, the government needed to step in and help. They helped with provisions, they helped with housing, and they started to think very much about the future. So the medieval city of London, which had survived through until 1666, was a higgledy-piggledy mishmash of small streets that had no particular logic to them other than that in the 1300s a cow might have walked down that street, or it was a way in which pigs were driven from one place to another. And as the embers cooled in London, people started to talk about the rebuilding and how a new, vibrant, organised, world-leading city could be built. Words rather familiar today. But while plans were being submitted, time was marching on. There was a weak government of the Stuart kings, and it was difficult to take decisions. Landlords and shopkeepers couldn't wait. Property regulations were complex, and so people returned to where their former premises and buildings had been and started to just rebuild them. The pattern of streets remained the same, so no grand designs for London. Let's contrast that with Lisbon almost 100 years later. All Saints' Day, the 1st of November, 1755, and early in the morning, the royal party had gone out and were a few miles outside the city as an enormous earthquake struck. Chasms 15 feet wide opened up in the streets. People ran, and then 40 minutes later the tidal wave came. The tidal wave came from the sea, and it took its course up the Tagus River, which rose 20 feet. And as I said, it was All Saints' Day, and the houses were full of candles, which were knocked over and caused a fire like no other, that destroyed almost the entire city. We'll never really know how many people died that morning. Estimates say maybe 30,000 from the population that was 250,000. King Jose and his party looked down upon the city, and at his wits' end, he wondered what divine intervention had caused this catastrophe and what he was to do. Amidst the wringing of hands and fervent prayers, the man of the moment stepped forward, the Marquis of Pombal. He said, "Bury the dead and feed the living." Plans to rebuild the city were immediate. The tsunami had struck on the 1st of November, and by the 4th of December, there were plans in place with 4 options for rebuilding the city. The first was to rebuild the city from the materials that were around. The second and third options looked at more modest remodelling of streets. The fourth was a total rebuild, and it was this one that the king went with. Boulevards, squares, wide open spaces, they were all completed in 22 years. So what lessons can we learn from the contrasting approaches of London and Lisbon as they came through their catastrophes as we pull through this first phase of COVID-19? A different simple rule was enabled in Portugal that gave a very different result to either London or indeed the 2 prior occasions Lisbon had been struck by similar earthquakes in 1321 and 1531. During the national emergency that was lockdown, when hospitals, for example, were emptied and any non-patient facing staff members were asked to stay at home wherever possible, and where many had to isolate, many of the formalities of governance were suspended or dramatically reduced or taken online. So standard board meetings with lengthy reports and supported by assurance from committees was really stepped away from for a period of 3 or 4 months in many organisations. And those working on the front line, those in direct managerial or patient-facing jobs and clinicians, just needed to get on with preparing for a national emergency and in some of our client areas dealing with an absolute wave of patients coming through the door. All this meant that decisions needed to be changed very quickly. In the NHS setting, the financial goals were suddenly abandoned, the performance goals such as the national targets were relaxed, the debt to the NHS was written off, and decisions were enabled very quickly under emergency powers. Of course, this has led to a progress in partnership working very rapidly. So this poses a very legitimate question, doesn't it? What can we retain in terms of agile decision making and getting things done quickly across a whole system that was difficult before you had the pandemic creating the environment in which decisions had to be made quickly? So as we come out of the first stage of the pandemic and into the autumn, the rules are being returned to, in the sense that the targets have become important, in the sense that the money again has become important, and the formality around complex decision making needs again to become important. So the trick is it possible to retain some of the agility that characterised the first stage of the pandemic and the national emergency, but at the same time not over-prioritise just one area of activity and think about the whole range of things that health services need to do? The next year is very clear for our National Health Service. Sir Simon Stevens and Amanda Pritchard have written to the whole service and they have laid out the plan, which includes return to targets, progress with developing integrated care systems, and new control totals. What that means in layman's jargon is not overspending. I worry that there's some wishful thinking in this, and that agile decision making going forward will return to being difficult and complex because the true lesson of what happened during COVID hasn't been appreciated. So people talk, and reasonably so, about needing to loosen up formality around things in order to get things done. But they fail to see that this happened when one of the simple rules of work was removed. And because it was removed, we had a step change in performance. It was third generation quality management at play. When you change one of the simple rules of work, you get a step change in performance.